I died in the same hospital where I had once saved Ethan's life. 5 years earlier, I had donated part of my liver without telling him I was a donor. The surgery had saved him, but the complications slowly destroyed my own health. Even then, I never regretted it. I loved him enough to believe that seeing him live was worth any price I had to pay. What I never imagined was that, when my own life finally reached its end, he wouldn't even be beside me. As my breathing became weaker, I kept staring at the hospital door, hoping he would walk through it before everything went dark. The nurses whispered that my husband had already arrived. Relief washed over me for a brief moment until one of them accidentally said something she thought I couldn't hear. "He's in orthopedics with Miss Claire." Claire. Even after all those years, that name still had the power to make my heart ache. She had twisted her ankle while rushing to the hospital after hearing about my condition, and Ethan had chosen to stay beside her. My monitors continued to beep as I waited alone. 23 minutes later, the sound became one long, endless tone. When I opened my eyes again, I was standing beside my own hospital bed. My body lay motionless beneath a white sheet while nurses quietly disconnected the machines. There was no pain anymore, only a strange emptiness. I tried calling for help, but nobody reacted. Then I looked through the glass doors and saw Ethan at the end of the hallway. He was holding Claire's shoulders, asking if she was hurt, reassuring her that everything would be fine. I almost laughed at the cruel joke fate had played on me. Even at the very end, I had still come second. A nurse finally approached him, her expression heavy with sympathy. "Mr. Hayes." "I'm very sorry." Ethan barely looked at her. "I know Claire will recover." The nurse hesitated before quietly replying, "I wasn't talking about Miss Claire. Your wife passed away 23 minutes ago." The words seemed to drain every drop of color from his face. "What did you say?" he asked, almost unable to breathe. When the nurse repeated herself, he stood completely still, staring into empty space as though his mind refused to understand what he had heard. Then, without saying another word, he ran. He ran toward me. By the time he reached my room, the nurses had already covered my face. His trembling hands pulled the sheet back, revealing the woman he had promised to spend his life with. He touched my cold cheek, his finger shaking uncontrollably. "No ... double quotes," he whispered. "Lily ... no. I told you I'd be right back. Right back." I had heard those words countless times during our marriage. Every time Claire needed him, he would smile apologetically and tell me he would be right back. Sometimes it took hours. Sometimes an entire evening. Sometimes our anniversary dinner ended with cold food because Claire needed someone to talk to. I always told myself I was overthinking it. After all, she had been his first love. Surely he only felt responsible for her. How naive I had been. Standing there beside my own body, I finally saw every memory differently, every excuse I had accepted, every promise I had chosen to believe. Ethan had never openly betrayed me. In fact, he had always been honest about one thing. Before we married, he admitted there had once been someone he believed he would love forever. Claire. She had disappeared overseas without saying goodbye, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. When he proposed to me years later, he told me those feelings belonged to the past. I wanted so badly to believe him that I ignored the tiny hesitation in his eyes. When Claire returned 3 years after our wedding, I welcomed her into our home myself. She apologized for leaving. Ethan forgave her within minutes. I convinced myself that was simply kindness. When she called him late at night because she felt lonely, I said nothing. When she spent holidays with our family because she claimed to have nowhere else to go, I smiled politely across the dinner table while they laughed about memories I had never been part of. Looking back, I realized love has a dangerous habit of turning obvious truths into harmless coincidences. As Ethan fell to his knees beside my body, sobbing harder than I had ever seen him cry, I expected to feel vindicated. Instead, I felt exhausted. His regret changed nothing. The years I had spent trying to become someone's first choice would never return. His tears could not give me back the birthdays, anniversaries, and quiet evenings I had spent pretending not to notice where his heart wandered. whenever Claire entered the room. Then something extraordinary happened. The hospital around me began to fade. The walls dissolved into countless points of light, and every sound grew distant until silence swallowed everything. I closed my eyes instinctively. When I opened them again, sunlight streamed through the window of my old apartment. My phone vibrated on the bedside table. I picked it up with trembling hands. "Ethan, I'll be there in 30 minutes. I can't wait to tell your father about our engagement." I stared at the message for a very long time before placing the phone back down. This was the day he was going to ask my father for permission to marry me. The day my first life truly began, except this time I already knew how it would end, and this time I wasn't going to stop him from choosing his first love. I didn't cry. That surprised me more than waking up 10 years in the past. I had imagined that if fate ever gave me another chance, I would scream, demand answers, or collapse under the weight of remembering an entire lifetime. Instead, I sat quietly on the edge of my bed, staring at the engagement ring resting inside its velvet box. In my first life, that ring had meant forever. Now it looked like a beautifully polished mistake. Half an hour later, Ethan arrived carrying flowers and the same nervous smile that had once made my heart race. He looked younger, lighter, untouched by the years that would eventually fill his face with regret. Seeing him again hurt less than I expected. Perhaps grief had already taken everything it wanted from me. "Lily," he said as soon as I opened the door, "your father is going to think I'm crazy if I keep pacing outside." I smiled politely and stepped aside. "You can come in during lunch." Everyone laughed while Ethan stumbled through the speech he had rehearsed all week. My mother cried before he even finished asking for permission to marry me. My father pretended to think about it before finally laughing and shaking Ethan's hand. It was exactly as I remembered, except this time I interrupted them. "I'm sorry," for simple words. The entire room fell silent. Ethan looked at me, confused. "What do you mean?" I slowly removed the ring from my finger and placed it on the table between us. "I can't marry you." No one spoke. Even the clock on the kitchen wall suddenly seemed too loud. Ethan laughed awkwardly, convinced I was joking. "Lily, this isn't funny." "I'm not joking." His smile disappeared. Did I do something wrong? I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him about the hospital room, about Claire, about the 23 minutes that had separated my death from his regret. I wanted to tell him how many nights I had cried myself to sleep while pretending I wasn't jealous of a woman he insisted was only part of his past. Instead, I simply shook my head. "No, you haven't done anything." "Not yet." My father stared at me in disbelief. "Sweetheart. Yesterday you couldn't stop talking about the wedding." "I know, so what changed?" "Everything. But how could I explain that I had already lived the next 10 years? I just realized we're not right for each other." Ethan's face turned pale. "You don't mean that." "I do." He reached across the table for my hand for the first time. I pulled it away. His fingers froze in midair. It was such a small movement. Yet I could see the exact moment something inside him shifted. Throughout our relationship, I had always been the one reaching for him first, holding his hand, calling after arguments, apologizing even when neither of us knew what I was apologizing for. This was the first time I had let him reach into empty space. He left my parents' house an hour later without saying goodbye. In my first life, I watched him walk away only once. This time, I didn't stop him. For the next few weeks, he called constantly. Sometimes he left long messages asking what had happened. Sometimes he drove past my apartment, hoping to catch me outside. Once, he waited nearly 3 hours in front of the bookstore where I worked, convinced I would eventually change my mind. I never did, not because I hated him. Hatred requires passion. What I felt was something much quieter. Acceptance. Without the wedding to plan. I suddenly had something I had never possessed before. Time. I used it differently. Instead of searching for dresses and venues, I enrolled in the business courses I had always postponed because marriage seemed more urgent. I accepted a promotion at the bookstore instead of turning it down to support Ethan's career. I convinced my father not to invest his retirement savings in a construction company that I knew would collapse 2 years later. When he asked how I could possibly know it was a bad idea, I simply told him I had a feeling. That feeling saved my parents from losing everything. It was the first time I realized this second life wasn't only about avoiding pain. It was also about protecting the people who had never stopped choosing me. 3 months later, I heard Claire had returned from overseas. The news reached me through mutual friends, just as it had in my first life. They said she looked exactly the same, only more mature. They said Ethan seemed happier after seeing her again. They said perhaps fate had reunited two people who were always meant to find each other. This time. The words didn't hurt. In fact, I smiled because that was exactly what I wanted. A week later, I saw them together for the first time. I had stopped at a small cafe near my office when they walked in laughing about something I couldn't hear. Ethan looked surprised to see me. Claire recognized me immediately and greeted me with the same warm smile I remembered. Lily, it's been so long. It has. I heard about the engagement. She hesitated. I'm sorry things didn't work out. So am I, Ethan said quietly. I looked at him for a moment before answering. I'm not. Neither of them expected that response. Claire quickly changed the subject, but I noticed the way Ethan kept watching me throughout the conversation. Not with love, with confusion. He couldn't understand why I looked peaceful. In his memory, I had always been the woman whose world revolved around him. The woman who canceled plans whenever he needed her. The woman who waited patiently while he gave pieces of himself to someone else. That woman no longer existed. As I stood to leave, Ethan followed me outside. Lily, I turned. Can we talk? I don't think there's anything left to say there. Has to be. He searched my face as though hoping to find the old version of me hiding somewhere beneath the surface. I don't understand how someone can stop loving another person overnight. I almost answered him. Then I remembered the hospital. I remembered the white sheet covering my face. I remembered him saying, I'm here now. No. Love hadn't disappeared overnight. It had died slowly, one disappointment at a time. I hope you're happy. Ethan, I said with a small smile. I truly do. Then I walked away, leaving him standing alone on the sidewalk. For the first time since we'd met, was the one watching me leave, and for reasons he couldn't yet understand. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had just lost something he would never get back. Months passed, and for the first time in years, my life no longer revolved around Ethan. I expanded the bookstore until it became one of the most popular independent shops in the city, attended every business seminar I had once postponed, and accepted opportunities I would have rejected in my first life simply because I had been too busy supporting someone else's dreams. My parents often told me I seemed different, happier, more confident. I never corrected them. They believed I had found myself after a painful breakup. The truth was much stranger. I had simply stopped living for a future that had never truly belonged to me. Ethan, meanwhile, seemed determined to prove that leaving me behind had been the right decision. Within 6 months, he and Clara were officially together. Everyone around them called it fate. They had loved each other once, lost each other, and somehow found their way back. Friends smiled whenever they saw them holding hands. Social media filled with photos of weekend trips, candlelit dinners, and captions about second chances. I looked at those pictures only once. Then I closed the page and never opened it again. Unlike my first life, I wasn't interested in watching their story unfold. I had already lived the ending. About a year later, I attended a charity gala organized by one of my publishing partners. I almost didn't go, but the company had helped fund our bookstore's literacy program, so I felt obligated to appear. The ballroom was crowded, filled with politicians, investors, and business owners. I was speaking with one of our sponsors when I noticed Ethan across the room. He looked older than he should have. Not physically, emotionally, there was a heaviness in his expression I recognized immediately. Our eyes met for only a second before he excused himself from his group and walked toward me. Lily, his voice was careful, almost hesitant. You look different. So do you, he laughed quietly. I suppose I deserve that. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. It no longer felt awkward. It simply felt finished. I've been meaning to talk to you, he finally admitted. I know you do. You've called the bookstore 3 times this month. His expression revealed that he hadn't expected me to know. I never left a message. You didn't have to. He lowered his eyes. Claire and I aren't doing very well. I waited. He seemed surprised that I wasn't asking questions. After a long silence, he answered them himself. I think I spent years chasing the memory of someone who no longer existed. His words sounded painfully familiar. I kept believing that if I could go back to the way things used to be, everything would finally feel right. And did it? He smiled sadly. No, for the first time, I felt genuinely sorry for him. Not because he had lost me, because he had spent so many years chasing the past that he had forgotten to appreciate the present. There are days, he continued, when I keep wondering why you left before anything even happened. I almost laughed. Before anything happened. If only he knew. I trusted my instincts. He nodded slowly. I think. They were better than mine. We spoke for only a few more minutes before someone called my name from the other side of the ballroom. As I turned to leave, Ethan suddenly stopped me. Lily, I looked back. If things had been different, he couldn't finish the sentence. They weren't. I replied gently. And that's okay. I walked away without looking back. In my first life, that conversation would have destroyed me. Now, it barely disturbed my peace. 3 months later, the phone rang just after midnight. The caller ID displayed Ethan's name. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. His voice was shaking. Lily, I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything. I remained silent. My father collapsed tonight. My heart tightened. I remembered. In my first life, this had happened almost a year later. The disease had progressed slowly because no one discovered it until it was too late. But I already knew what it was. I knew the symptoms, the specialist, even the experimental treatment that would eventually save him. In my first life, I had been the one who found the doctor. I had spent months researching until I discovered the trial that gave Ethan's father another 10 years to live. No one had ever known it was me. Not even Ethan. Lily, his voice broke. The doctors don't know what's wrong. I closed my eyes. There it was. The moment fate had quietly been leading us toward since the day I woke up in the past. Only I could point him toward the right hospital. Only I knew which doctor would recognize the disease before it became irreversible. Only I could save his father, just as I had once saved him. He took a trembling breath. I don't know why, but I had this feeling you'd know what to do. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. In my first life, I wouldn't have hesitated. I would have run to the hospital without even putting on my shoes. I would have stayed awake for weeks searching for answers. I would have sacrificed everything if it meant seeing relief in Ethan's eyes. But this wasn't my first life anymore. This was the life I had fought to reclaim. I hope your father recovers, I said quietly. I truly mean that. Lily, but I can't be the person you call every time your world falls apart. His breathing became uneven. Please no, Ethan, it wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was the first boundary I had ever drawn. The woman who spent 10 years saving you doesn't exist anymore. I wished him well and ended the call. A few weeks later, I learned that Ethan's father had eventually been diagnosed correctly after being transferred to another hospital. The treatment came later than it should have, leaving permanent damage that could have been avoided, but he survived. When I heard the news, I smiled, not because he had suffered, because I no longer believed it was my responsibility to rescue people who had never chosen to stay beside me. Several years passed. My bookstore grew into a publishing company. My parents retired comfortably. I met someone who never made me compete with yesterday for a place in his tomorrow. Loving him felt strangely easy. There were no doubts to silence, no excuses to invent, no invisible third person standing between us. One autumn afternoon, I crossed paths with Ethan one last time. His hair was beginning to turn gray. Mine probably was too. He smiled when he saw me. You look happy. I am. He nodded, as though confirming something he had suspected for years. I finally understand. I didn't ask what he meant. You were never asking me to stop loving Claire, he said quietly. You were asking me to choose you. A gentle breeze carried fallen leaves across the sidewalk between us. By the time I understood the difference, he smiled with quiet resignation. It was already too late. I returned his smile, not with triumph, but with peace. Some people believe life gives you a second chance to fix the past. I don't. I think it gives you a second chance to stop repeating it. In my first life, I begged someone else to choose me. In my second life, I finally chose myself. And that decision changed everything.